Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. And today we are going to continue the chapter of Age of Vijayanagar and the Pahamanadis. We're going to start with the passage State and Economy under Vijayanagar. So, without any further ado, let's get started. The concept of kingship among the Vijayanagar rulers was high. In his book on polity, Krishnadev Raya advises the king that with great care and according to your power you should attend to work of protecting the good and punishing the wicked without neglecting anything that you see or hear. He also enjoined upon the king to levy taxes from his people moderately. So Krishnadev Raya was known to be a person with a taste for literature, and he has written many books and plays, out of which his book on polity is mentioned over here, in which he advises that the king, with great care and according to your power, you should attend the work of protecting the good and punishing the wicked without neglecting anything that you see or hear. He also enjoined upon the king to levy taxes from his people moderately. In the Vijayanagar kingdom, the king was advised by a council of ministers which consisted of the great nobles of the kingdom. The kingdom was divided into rajas or mandalam provinces, below which were Nadu district, Sthala sub-district, and Grama village. So we'll just write the structure of it so that we would remember it in a decreasing order. So the first division was Rajas, then the Nadus, then the Sthala, which is the sub-district, and then the Gram. This was the structure of the kingdom in Vijayanagar. The Chola tradition of Vijayanagar, the Chola traditions of village self-government were considerably weakened during under Vijayanagar rule. So the Chola traditions of village self-government were considerably weakened under Vijayanagar rule. The growth of hereditary Nayakships tended to curb their freedom and initiative. So this was because of the hereditary Nayakships. The governors of the provinces were royal princes at first. Later, persons belonging to vassal ruling families and nobles were also appointed as governors. The provincial governors had a large measure of autonomy. They held their own courts, appointed their own officers, and maintained their own armies. They were allowed to issue their own coins, though of small denominations only. There was no regular term for a provincial governor, his term depending on his ability and his strength. The governor had the right to impose new taxes or remit old ones. Each governor paid a fixed contribution in men and money into the central government. It had been estimated that while the income of the kingdom was 12 million parados, the central government got only the half the amount. So unlike the modern forms where the central government collects the taxes, the major taxes, and then devolves it to the states and other institutions, here this provinces of the governor actually collected the taxes, and they were the ones who would pay the contribution to the central government of the Vijayanagar. So what we could see over here is that although the collection was 12 million parados, the central government got only half of the share. There were many areas in the empire where there were many areas in the empire which were under the control of subordinate rulers, that is, those who had been defeated in war but whose kingdoms have been restored to them. In the last centrally controlled area, the king granted amaram or territory with a fixed revenue to military chiefs. These chiefs, who were called Palayagar, Palegar, or Nayaks, had to maintain a fixed number of foot soldiers, horses, and elephants for the services of the state. The Nayaks or Palegars also had to pay a sum of money to the central exchequer. They formed a very powerful section, and sometimes it was difficult for the government to control them. These internal weaknesses of the Vijayanagara Empire contributed to its defeat in the Battle of Panighatti. Manihatti, and its subsequent disintegration. Many of the Nayaks, such as those of Tanjore and Madurai, became independent from that time. So the Nayaks were the ones who were given territories with a fixed revenue. These were the military chiefs, and they were called the Palayagar, Palegar, or Nayaks. And they had to maintain a fixed number of foot soldiers, elephants, horse, artillery, and they also had to submit some contribution to the central exchequer. However, they sometimes assumed more autonomy, more power, and this would eventually lead to the defeat of Vijayanagar in the Battle of Badda. Historians are not agreed about the economic condition of the peasantry under the Vijayanagar rule, because most of the travelers had little knowledge about Vijay's life and they spoke of it in very general terms. In general, it may be presumed that the economic life of the people remained more or less the same. Their houses were mostly thatched with a small door. They generally went about barefooted and wore little above the waist. People of the upper classes sometimes wore costly shoes and a silk turban on their heads, but did not cover themselves above the waist. All classes of people were fond of ornaments and wore them in their ears or in their necks, on their arms, etc. We have very little idea about the share of the produce the peasants were required to pay. According to an inscription, the rate of taxes were as follows: one third of the produce of kuruvai, a type of rice during winter; one fourth of sesame, ragi, horse crab, etc., one sixth of millet and other crops cultivated on dry land. Thus, the rate varied according to the types of crops, soil, method of irrigation, etc. In addition to the land tax, there were various other taxes such as property tax, tax on sale of produce, profession taxes, military contribution, in times of distress, tax on marriage, etc. 16th century traveler Nikitin says the land is overstocked with people, but those in the country are very miserable, while the nobles are extremely affluent and delight in luxury. Urban life grew under the Vijayanagar Empire and trade flourished. Towns grew, many of them around temples. The temples were very large and needed supply of foodstuff and commodities for distribution of prasadam to the pilgrims, service of God, the priests, etc. The temples were rich and also took active part in trade, both internal and overseas. There was considerable growth of towns and urbanization under the Vijayanagar rule. It is in this sense that many historians consider the period of Vijayanagar rule to be a period of transition from the old to a new economy. So we could see instances of urbanization in the Vijayanagar ruler, and also the temples were also involved in trade, be it internal and overseas. There was considerable growth of towns and urbanization, and according to historians, the Vijayanagar rule can be termed as a period of transition from the old to the new economy. The advent of the Portuguese. The landing of Vasco da Gama at Calicut in 1498 with two ships with Gujarati pilots aboard who had guided the ships from African coast to Calicut has often been considered the beginning of a new phase during which the control of ocean passed into the hands of the Europeans. The Europeans, as we've seen, had a greater hand in the navy and the naval seas, so they could dominate it over there. And the advent of the Portuguese because of the coming of Vasco da Gama in 1498 to the Calicut port was a beginning of a new phase in Indian history. Indian trade and traders received a setback, and ultimately the Europeans were able to establish their colonial rule and domination over India and most of the neighboring countries. This picture has been called into question by both Western and Indian historians, especially after World War II and the end of European political rule over the countries of the region. Before we assess the impact of Portuguese on Indian society, economy, and politics, let us first examine the factors which brought the Portuguese to India. So, why will a Portuguese come to India? What was there in India? What was so great that the Portuguese had to travel overseas and for such long days and come to India? Why did they want that? So, you just study it over here. Very broadly, the Portuguese came to India at a time when European economy was growing rapidly, thanks to the expansion of land under cultivation on account of the drainage of marshes and cutting of forest, the introduction of a improved plough and more scientific rotation of crops, which also led to an increase in the growth of cattle and supply of meat. The growth was reflected in the rise of towns and increase in trade, both internal and external. Since Roman times, there had been a steady demand for Oriental goods. The European economy was already flourishing because of the technological interventions, and also there were significant growth in trade, both internal and external. The Portuguese, this led to the Europeans to be more flourishing and to be more technically advanced. Since Roman times, there had been a steady demand for Oriental goods. These included silk from China, spices and drugs from India and Southeast Asia. With with economic revival, this demand increased, especially the demand for pepper and spices, which were needed to make meat palatable. Since due to shortage of fodder, many cattle were slaughtered during winter and the meat salted up. So they basically wanted the spices like pepper and some other spices to make the meat more palatable, because due to the shortage of fodder, many cattle were slaughtered during winter and the meat salted up. So they wanted to make the meat more palatable, more easy to consume. Pepper was bought. Pepper was brought to the Levant, Egypt, and the Black Sea ports overland and partly by sea from India and Southeast Asia. With the rise of the power of the Ottoman Turks from the early part of the 15th century, all these areas came under the control of the Turks. Thus, they captured Constantinople in 1453 and Syria and Egypt later. The Turks were not opposed to trade, but the virtual monopoly over pepper established by them was bound to work against the Europeans. The expansion of Turkish power towards Eastern Europe and the growth of Turkish navy, which made the Eastern Mediterranean a Turkish lake, also alarmed the Europeans. Venice and Genoa, which had been the most active in the trade of Oriental goods, were too small to stand up to the Turks. Venice, in particular, quickly came to terms with the Turks. The banner of struggle against the Turkish danger was therefore taken up by the powers in the western part of the Mediterranean, Spain and Portugal. They were aided with money and men by the North Europeans and by ship and technical knowledge of the Genoese, who were the rivals of Venice. It was not the Portuguese alone, but all these elements which started the search for a direct sea route to India, and hence started the era of naval discoveries, including the discovery of America by Genius, Christopher Columbus, or rediscovery because Norsemen from the north had reached America earlier, as also the Red Indians along the Bering Strait. So, what we could infer from this paragraph is that the Europeans wanted to make their meat more palatable because due to the shortage of fodder, there was a slaughter of cattle, and their meat has salted up, so they wanted pepper and other spices to make it more easy to consume. So they were trying to this spices actually came from India and Southeast Asia, so they were trying to decipher a route other than that, which was basically dominated by the Turks. So they were trying to discover a direct sea route to India, and it was not just the Portuguese alone, it was all in the Europe, the Spain, Portugal, everyone. The work of the Portuguese ruler Don Henrique, generally called Henry the Navigator, should be seen in this conquest. In 1418, Prince Henry sent two or three ships every year to explore the western coast of Africa and to search out a sea route to India. His objects were twofold: first, to oust the Arabs as well as his European rivals, the Venetians, from the rich eastern trade, and the second, to counterpoise the growing power of the Turks and Arabs by converting the heathens of Africa and Asia through Christianity. Both objectives were steadily pursued. In fact, they justified and supported each other. The Pope lent his support by issuing a bull in 1453 by which he granted to Portugal in perpetuity whatever lands is discovered beyond Cape Northern Africa up to India on the condition of converting to Christianity the peoples of those lands. So there was a conversion persuasion going on over there on the part of Prince Henry of Portugal. In 1488, in 1488, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope and laid the basis of direct trade links between Europe and India. Such long sea voyages were made possible by a number of remarkable inventions, notably the mariner's compass and the astrolabe for fixing the height of heavenly bodies for purpose of navigation. The former was known to the Chinese several centuries earlier, but was not widely used. The astrolabe, astrolabe was, however, widely used by the Arabs, Indians, and others. Nor were the European ships superior in construction to the ships such as the Chinese junks used in Asian waters at that time. The spirit of daring and enterprise displayed by the Europeans was certainly new. The spirit has been traced back to the revival and growth of trade and commerce from the 13th century onwards, leading to intense rivalry among the European states. As important was the new intellectual stirring called the Renaissance. The Renaissance signified above all a spirit of independent investigation rather than being rather than basing oneself either on the revealed word or on wisdom enshrined in the church. These developments led to rapid assimilation, dispersion, and improvement of other foreign, Arab, and Chinese inventions such as the gunpowder, printing, telescope, etc. Developments in metallurgy led to the production of better quality guns. Vasco da Gama landed in Calicut in 1498 with Gujarati pilots on board. The strong colony of the Arab merchants settled there was hostile, but the Zamorin welcomed the Portuguese and allowed them to take pepper, drugs, etc. on board. In Portugal, the goods brought by Gama were computed at 60 times the cost of the entire expedition. Despite this, direct trade between India and Europe grew slowly. One reason for this was the monopoly exercised by the Portuguese government. From the beginning, the Portuguese rulers were determined to treat the Eastern trade as royal monopoly, excluding not only rival nations in Europe and Asia but also private Portuguese traders. Alarmed at growing power of the Portuguese, the Sultan of Egypt fitted a fleet and sent it towards India. The fleet was joined by a contingent of ships belonging to the ruler of Gujarat. After an initial victory in the After an initial victory in which the son of the Portuguese governor Don Almeida was killed, this combined fleet was routed by the Portuguese in 1509. This made the Portuguese navy supreme in the Indian Ocean and enabled the Portuguese to extend their operations towards the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. Shortly after, Albuquerque succeeded as the governor of the Portuguese possession in the east. He advocated and embarked upon a policy of dominating the entire Oriental commerce by setting up forts at various strategic places in Asia and Africa. This was to be supplemented by a strong navy. Defending his philosophy, he wrote, "A dominion founded on a navy alone cannot last." Lacking forts, he argued, neither will they, the rulers, trade or be on friendly terms with you. Albuquerque initiated his new policy by capturing Goa from Bijapur in 1510. The island of Goa was an excellent natural harbor and fort. It was strategically located, and from it the Portuguese could command the Malabar trade and watch the policies of the rulers in the Deccan. It was also near to the Gujarat seaports for the Portuguese to make their presence felt there. Goa was thus suited to be the principal center of Portuguese commerce and political activity in the east. Portuguese was also able to extend their possession on the mainland opposite Goa and to blockade and sack the Bijapuri ports of Tanda, Rajouri, and Dabhol, thus paralyzing the Bijapur sea trade. So, what we could infer from this paragraph is that the Portuguese, in order to expand their claims over the Indian seaports, they tried to annex Goa and they captured it in 1510 from the Bijapuri rulers. This gave them a strategic edge because Goa was a natural harbor and fort, and it would give them an opportunity to command over the Malabar trade as well as to keep their eyes on the Gujarat ports so that it would make them feel their presence over there. Also, it would also give them an opportunity to see over the Deccan rulers, and this was a threat to the Bijapuri kingdom because they also had their eyes on the forts of Danda, Rajouri, and Dabhol in order to paralyze the Bijapur's sea trade. From their base at Goa, Portuguese further strengthened their position by establishing forts at Colombo in Sri Lanka, at Achin in Sumatra, and at Malacca port, which controlled the exit and entry to the narrow gulf between the Malaya Peninsula and Sumatra. The Portuguese also established a station at the island of Socotra at the mouth of the Red Sea. So the Portuguese also established a station at the island of Socotra at the mouth of Red Sea. They failed to capture Aden, and the Red Sea remained outside their control. But they forced the rulers of Hormuz, which controlled entry into the Persian Gulf, to permit them to establish a fort there. So they had made their forts in various strategic locations, which are Colombo in Sri Lanka, Aceh in Sumatra, Malacca Port, uh, which were basically strategic because these controlled the exit and entry to the narrow gulf between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra. They also established a station in Socotra, but they could not capture the Gulf of Aden, and Red Sea basically remained outside their control, but they were able to force the ruler of Ormus to give them an entry and to make and to let them build a fort into the Persian Gulf. The success of the Portuguese was, however, more apparent than real. From the beginning, they had to face a number of challenges, both external and internal. The external challenge was the one posed by the Turks, who were sometimes joined by the Arabs and some Indian powers. After conquering Syria, Egypt, and Arabia, the Turks had gone on to conquer Eastern Europe and in 1529, threatening Vienna, the capital of Central Europe and the key to its defense. The growth of Turkish power on the coast of Red Sea and the Persian Gulf seems to be presage seems to presage a conflict between the Turks and the Portuguese for dominating the western part of the Indian Ocean. So the growth of Turkish power on the coast of Red Sea and Persian Gulf seemed to presage a conflict between the Turks and the Portuguese for dominating the western part of the Indian Ocean. The Ottoman Grand Wazir Lutfi Pasha, writing after 1541, told the Turkish Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, under the previous sultans there were many who ruled the land, but few who ruled the sea. In the conduct of naval warfare, the infidels are ahead of us. We must overcome them. In view of growing Portuguese threat to the Gujarat trade and the coastal areas, the Sultan of Gujarat sent an embassy to the Ottoman ruler, congratulating him on the victories and seeking his support. In return, the Ottoman ruler expressed a desire to combat the infidels, that is, the Portuguese, who had disturbed the shores of Arabia. From this time onwards, there was a continuous exchange of embassies and letters between the two countries. So, the ruler of Gujarat, the Sultan of Gujarat, was already apprehensive of the Portuguese ascent to the Indian to the Gujarat trade and Gujarat port. So he sent an he exchanged many letters and embassies with the Ottoman Turks, who actually wanted to uh, uproot the infidels from the sea, which were obviously the Portuguese. The Turks ousted the Portuguese from the Red Sea, and in 1529 a strong fleet under Suleiman Rez was dispatched to aid Bahadur Shah, the ruler of Gujarat. Bahadur Shah received it well, and two of the Turkish officials who were given Indian names were appointed governors of Surat and Diu, respectively. Of these two, Rumi Khan was later to earn a great name for himself as a master gunner. 1531, after intriguing with local officials, the Portuguese attacked Daman and Diu, but the Ottoman commander Rumi Khan repulsed the attack. However, the Portuguese built a fort at Chaul, lower down the coast. Before the Gujarat-Turkish alliance could be consolidated, a bigger threat to Gujarat appeared from the side of the Mughals. Humayun attacked Gujarat. In order to meet this threat, Bahadur Shah granted the island of Bassein to the Portuguese. A defensive-offensive alliance against the Mughals was also concluded, and the Portuguese were allowed to build a fort at Diu. Thus were the Portuguese able to establish their foothold in Gujarat. So the Portuguese were basically a threat for the entire nation, not just for Gujarat itself. But since because of the Mughal invasion in Gujarat by Humayun, the Portuguese shook hands with the Sultan of Gujarat, and the ruler of Gujarat basically granted the island of Bassein to them in order to solve this conflict with Humayun, so that he could counter Humayun with Portuguese on his side. So this defensive offensive alliance against the Mughals was now concluded, and the Portuguese were now allowed to build a fort at Diu as well. The Portuguese now were able to establish their foothold in Gujarat. Bahadur Shah soon repented his concessions to the Portuguese. Following the expulsions of the Mughals from Gujarat, he once again appealed to the Ottoman Sultan for help and tried to limit the Portuguese encroachments at Diu. During the negotiations, Bahadur Shah, aboard, who was abroad, one of the ships of the governor of the fort, suspected treachery. In the scuffle which ensued, the Portuguese governor was killed and Bahadur Shah drowned while swimming ashore. This was in 1536. So the ruler of Gujarat was actually very much apprehensive of Portuguese tactics and ideas, and he sent a message for help to the Ottoman Turks, but uh, unfortunately he died due to drowning, and this was in 1536. Although the Ottoman sultans claimed to be champions of Islam and hence opponents of Portuguese, they did not in practice seriously contest the position of the Portuguese in the Persian Gulf or beyond. This, uh, despite the fact that the Turks had broadly kept pace with the growth of artillery and to lesser extent with the naval sizes in the west. The Turkish navy dominated in the eastern Mediterranean and even made raids beyond Gibraltar. The Turks made their biggest naval demonstration against the Portuguese in Indian waters in 1536. Their fleet consisted of 45 galleons carrying 20,000 men, including 7,000 land soldiers or janissaries. janissaries. Many of the sailors had been pressed into service from the Venetian galleys at Alexandria. The fleet, commanded by Suleiman Pasha, an old man of 82 who was the most trusted of the Sultan and had been appointed the governor of Cairo, appeared before Diu in 1538 and besieged it. Unfortunately, the Turkish admiral behaved in an arrogant manner and the Sultan of Gujarat withdrew his support. After a siege of 2 months, the Turkish fleet retired, following news of the arrival of the formidable armada to relieve Diu. The Turkish threat to the Portuguese perished for another 2 decades. In 1551, Peri Reis, who was assisted by the Zamorin of Calicut, attacked the Portuguese forts at Muscat and Ormuz. Meanwhile, the Portuguese strengthened their position by securing Daman from its ruler. A final Ottoman expedition was sent under Ali Reis in 1554. The failure of this expedition resulted in a final change in the Turkish Shah. In 1556, Portuguese and the Ottomans came to an agreement to share the spice and the Indian trade and not to clash in the Arab seas. So the rivals actually shook hands and there was a reconciliation between the Portuguese and the Ottomans after many failed expeditions from the Ottoman side. The Ottomans shifted their interest once again to Europe and came to an agreement with the Portuguese for dividing the Oriental trade between them. This precluded their alliance with the rising Mughal power against the Portuguese, but it also had economic consequences as we shall see. So the Portuguese and Ottomans actually came into an agreement whereby they decided to share the spice and the Indian trade and not to clash with the Arab seas. So this precluded their alliance with the rising Mughal power against the Portuguese because they were now on the sides of the Portuguese. They actually were in a coalition with them. So the Portuguese impact on Indian trade, society and politics. From the beginning, the Portuguese could neither adequately police the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean nor control the trade or the traders there. All they could try to do was to monopolize certain goods and tax the others. Thus, the trade in pepper, arms, and ammunition and war horses was declared a royal monopoly. Pepper, arms, ammunition, and war horses was declared a royal monopoly. No nation, not even Portuguese private traders, were allowed to engage in the trade of these goods. Ships engaged in the trade of other commodities had to take a permit from the Portuguese officials. The Portuguese also attempted to force all ships going to the east or to Africa to pass by Goa and pay customs duties there. To enforce these rules, the Portuguese arrogated to themselves the right to search any ship suspected of engaging in contraband trade. Ships which refused to be searched could be treated as prizes of war and sunk or captured, and the men and women aboard treated as slaves. This led to continuous friction. The Portuguese soon found that they stood more to lose on land than they gained on sea by such practices, which were quite contrary to the practice and traditions of open trade in Asian waters. True, many Arab and Indian ships began to carry cannons and soldiers, but it was more a safeguard against sea pirates which infested the Malabar and Arab coast. The Portuguese were hardly able to change the established pattern of Asian trade networks. The Gujarati and Arab traders continued to dominate some of the most lucrative Asian trades, that is, the trade in Indian textiles, supplemented by rice and sugar, against which they obtained spices from the southeast, gold and horses from West Asia, and silk and porcelain from China. So the main commodity for export was the Indian textiles and the rice and sugar, against which they obtained the spices from Southeast Asia, gold and horses from the West Asia, and silk and porcelain from China. The Portuguese were not even able to monopolize the pepper and spice trade to Europe, except for a couple of decades at the outset. By the end of the 17th century, the supply of pepper to Levant and Egyptian markets, both overland and with the Red Sea, was as large as it had been earlier. This was because the great Asian empires, the Mughal and the Safavid, were able to promote and safeguard overland trade, and also because the Gujaratis were able to arrange a new supply route from Achin in Sumatra to Egypt via Lakshadweep and Red Sea, where the Portuguese navy could not operate. So the Gujaratis were clever enough to uh, arrange a new supply route from Achin in Sumatra to Egypt via the Lakshadweep and the Red Sea, where the Portuguese navy could not operate. Nor were the Portuguese able to develop Goa as the dominant center of Asian trade, eclipsing Cambay and later Surat in Gujarat. However, they adversely affected the Malabar trade and the sea trade from Bengal, which they preyed upon from Chittagong. Portuguese, however, opened up Indus trade with Japan, from which copper and silver were obtained. They also opened up India's trade with Philippines. From the Philippines, the Portuguese carried Indian textiles to South America and brought back silver in exchange. They demonstrated how naval power could be used to harass and hamper the trade, even of such a developed country as India, as also to open new lines of trade. So the Portuguese effects on India are twofold. First was their hampering the trade of such a well-developed country who had trade relations with different parts of the world on the basis of the spices, textiles, rice, sugar, which we exported. However, they also opened new lines of trade by opening the trade between India and Japan, India and Philippines, and also India and South America. The Portuguese could not as a bridge for transmitting to India the science and technology which had grown in Europe since the Renaissance. This was partly because the Portuguese were themselves not deeply affected by the Renaissance as Italy and North Europe. Later, with the growth of Catholic religious reaction led by the Jesuits, they even set their face against the new sciences. So they were not able to transfer the new technologies which were uh, growing in the Europe, which were able to bring about new technological inventions because they themselves were not very much affected by the Renaissance, and they basically, after some time, uh, set their face against the new science. They did, however, help to transmit a number of agriculture products from Central America, such as potato, tobacco, maize, peanut, etc. These became widespread only gradually. So they were the ones who brought potato, tobacco, maize, and peanut from Central America. The defeat of Vijayanagar at Bannihatti in 1565 emboldened the Deccan states to make a concentrated effort to dislodge the Portuguese from the Deccan coast, threatened Bijapur in the south. Peace with Portuguese was essential since they controlled the horse trade and hostilities with them would have meant a diversion of the trade in favor of Vijayanagar. I'll just read it again. So long as Vijayanagar had threatened Bijapur in the south, peace with Portuguese was essential since they controlled the horse trade, and hostilities with them would have meant a diversion of the trade in favor of Vijayanagar. In 1570, Adil Ali Shah, the Sultan of Bijapur, entered into an agreement with the Sultan of Ahmednagar. The Zamorin of Calicut was also drawn into alliance. The allies decided to attack the Portuguese positions in their own dominions. Adil Shah personally led the attack against Goa, while Nizam Shah besieged Chaul. But once again, the Portuguese defense, backed up by their navy, proved to be strong. Thus, the Portuguese remained masters of the Indian Sea and the Deccan coast. With this, we've come to an end of this chapter on Vijayanagar and the Mahabharadis, along with the advent of the Portuguese. We'll continue with the next chapters of medieval history. Till then, see ya. Bye.